Welcome to episode 2 of Refactoring with Bob. I'm your host, Bob, and I know it looks like I'm wearing the same shirt as episode 1, but this is actually a different shirt that just looks the same. It's actually a different day, and you can tell because now I'm wearing a hat. Let's get started. All right, today we're going to look at a gated content. So gated content is basically... Actually, take this off. I don't really like wearing hats while I'm coding. Gated content is basically there's a form on a website that someone has to fill out before they get access to like a PDF or something. This is a very common thing that we get asked to do. Here we've got one. This is just straight MVC. And actually it's kind of mocked up MVC. I should note that this is not real code. Again, this is just something I came up with, but it's based off of real patterns, real things I see. So we're going to be taking a look at this. There are basically two methods that we need to look at. There's going to be the index method, which is what happens when you land on the page and you see the form. And then there's the submit method, which is what happens when you actually fill out the form and click the little submit button. It goes to this method. I'll warn you up front that this episode is going to be a little bit more rambly and go a little bit longer because this is a fairly chunky piece, and I had a bunch of things I kind of wanted to talk about and cover. So let's dive right in. So the first thing I noticed right off the bat is that we've got these injected properties, and what that's telling me is that we're using some kind of inversion of control or dependency injection, and it's using an injected property. And so I don't know what inversion of control we're using, but my assumption is that this works. Off the bat, the first thing I would probably think about is, does this setter need to exist? That probably depends on what framework you're using, but some of them probably don't require it, and I could probably just make these getters. But it's just something to look at. I'm going to leave them. I'm going to assume that whoever did this did the right thing, but maybe I would look into it if this were real production code. All right, let's start with the index. This is the method that it does a few things, but basically it either redirects them to the content because they've already filled out the form and it's still valid, or it displays a form for them to fill out. Those are kind of the two possibilities. So right off the bat, I noticed that record is kind of grayed out. The compiler is basically telling me that this setting it to null here is unnecessary because I'm using it as an out parameter here, and out parameters are guaranteed to be set, so there's no point in initializing it at this moment. If I do that, now it's no longer gray because the compiler knows that I'm doing this. But I could actually go one step further. I don't need to declare it on this line. I can use the new syntax and declare it up there and just get rid of that line. Super minor thing, but I like the new syntax, and so I tend to use it. So we're calling some kind of submission API, and this dot service thing. That is just part of this injected system, and so I just have to call dot service on all of the injected dependencies. So submission API.service, so we're going to try get user submission. We're passing in the current user ID. I notice that we're just assuming that has a value. This is one of the cases where I would maybe do some research and see, is that assumption valid? I don't know. But we're also accepting content ID. So we're accepting content ID as a parameter, which in MVC terms means it's either being posted as a parameter, like a form parameter, or if it's a get, which I know the index method should be a get, it'll be on the query string. And so I'm accepting a content ID on the query string. But again, I'm accepting a nullable content ID, but I'm just doing .value here without actually validating that it has a value. So that to me is kind of wrong. What could potentially happen is someone hits the form page or whatever and doesn't have that query string value. And then instead of having it do something sensible, it just throws an error and they get, hopefully not the yellow screen of death, because you shouldn't be showing that in production, but they'll see your error page, assuming you've got error handling set up. And maybe that's not what you want. Maybe you don't care, because a lot of times anyone that's visiting the page that's missing query string parameters is probably a bot anyways, and who cares if bots see error messages, as long as they don't see the detailed error messages. I mean, if they just see the generic error page, that's what you get for being a bot. Not to be prejudiced against bots or anything, but in 2030 I'm probably going to get in trouble for having said that. But let's say if you don't want people to see your generic error message, you might put a little check in here up top, content ID has value. So if they did not provide a valid content ID, I think think I can just return not found result, call it good. So now they'll at least just see the 404 page, which I think is technically more correct. I can't redirect you to content if you don't tell me what the content ID is, so it's not found. Small change. So now let's see here. So we get a result. We check to see, okay, did the user, I think what this is pulling is, did the user have a successful submission in the database? And so we try to get that submission, and if they do, we know that they have access, and so we just redirect them straight to the content. If it's not success, we check and see, okay, here, okay, so this is a bug. Apparently, if it's a success, we do this. And then in this branch, we know it's definitely not success, but we're checking for success again, so that is clearly a bug. We'll have to dive into what that means, but it looks like it's trying to pre-fill their information. So I'm guessing it should actually be if they have a record and we know information about them, but maybe they don't have access to this specific content, or maybe it's expired or whatever, we can at least pre-fill the form for them. That's a very common requirement for these, is if I've filled out one form and I have to fill out another one, it should just be pre-filled. So I think that's what we're trying to accomplish, but we are not succeeding. Next, I see we got a list of select item lists, so we're filling out a drop-down menu. That's fine, okay. It's not great to have that just hard-coded in your code, but it happens. Let's be honest. I see it all the time. I'm going to let it slide for now. We may come back to this. And then here we return a view. So one thing that stands out that I don't like with this view model is we create the view model up here, and then we actually fill out information in the view model in this branch, but only in this branch. And then we return the view model here. So I think we can fix a few things about this. So first of all, in here we're exiting the function early, so this does not need to be an else. This can just continue going forward. Anytime you have an if where this branch exits early every time, you don't need to have the else part of it, because you've exited. You either exit or you don't. There's, it just continues. So we'll do that, and I think that makes it a little more clear. So now, instead of having view model declared up here and then potentially never used, I'll just declare it down here instead. I think that's a best practice. I really like to have variables declared as close to where they're actually used as possible. I don't like to have, I'm not a fan of declaring all the variables at the top, because this isn't JavaScript, this is C#. And we can do that. We can just declare it immediately before it's needed. All right. So we have this check where we're checking to see if it's a success. We know that's not correct. Let's look at what else we can have. So user's not found. That probably means we don't have any information to fill out. Content is not found. Well, if the content's not found, we should probably be returning a 404 instead. So I don't know how to sensibly handle that at this point. Session expired. So they actually did have content, but they need to fill out the form again because it's been too long ago. And user found no access to content. So they probably filled out the record for some other content, but they didn't fill it out for this content, and they have to do it again. So I think we can sensibly handle some of these different cases. Wow, there's a lot of code in here. But we're not currently doing that. So there's a couple options. We could take those two cases where we know the session is expired, but they have a valid record. Or, as you can tell, I hate typing, so I like to copy paste. Either that, or the user was found but doesn't have any access to the content. So we know in those cases we can pre-fill the content, and then this is fine. The other thing we could do is put in here, so if we know that the content doesn't exist, it's sort of like they didn't provide a content ID, we can just return content not found. And I should probably be consistent up here and do this. There we go. So if they didn't provide a content ID, we bail out. If they have access, we send them on to the content that they have access to. If we find out that the content that they provided to us, the ID they provided to us, doesn't exist, then we say not found again. If the session is expired, or they the user was found but does not have access to this content, we pre-fill the record, then we fill in this dropdown, and then we return the view. So at this point, the index method is actually probably okay. I'm going to show you another way to do this, and I don't know that this way is any better. It's just different, and it really depends on your personal taste. You might like this other way better, you might not. Again, this one boils down to personal preference. I would be fine with either way in a code review, but just to give you an idea of another option. So I'm just going to comment out this old code so we can quickly grab it. And so instead of doing this, you'll notice we have a pattern of if result equals, if result equals, if result equals, result equals. A lot of times in those cases, you can actually do a switch statement. So let's try it. I'm going to do a switch statement here. So the most basic value is success. Whoops, that's not success. And when they're successful, we bail out. We return redirect content. We're good. Good job, buddy. The next easy one to handle is the content's not found. We know what to do there. We bail out again. Whoops. With a not found. We give them the 404. Go 404 yourself. Now we have two cases where we know that that they filled out the form, and we can pre-fill stuff, but we don't want to necessarily break out just yet. But we know what to do in these cases. Let me fill this stuff out. Now, what cases have we not handled? We still have user not found. So what happens in that case? Well, just because they don't exist in the database now doesn't mean they're going to exist. So user not found is sort of like they've never filled out a form. So basically we just can't pre-fill the form, but we still want them to see the form. All right. So I've got an error here. View models does not exist yet, so I'm going to declare it as close to this as I can, right up here. We pre-fill it, and then we do this. Now, I know I'm kind of violating what I talked about earlier, where I'm declaring this view model and then potentially never using it in this branch or in this branch, and that's kind of a bummer, but it works. It's fine. We could do some truly heinous stuff here too as well, because what we're doing right now is we have two branches in the switch statement that return, and then we have two branches that just break. And from just a pure code perspective, that feels a little awkward and ugly. But the solution to that, in my opinion, is worse than the current problem, but I'll show you the solution to this. What we could do is, in the case where the user is not found, we fill out that dropdown and return the view. We still need to do that in this, but we've just pre-filled this, and so we can actually, goto case, and then I think it's this. If I saw this in a code review, I'd say no, we're not going to do that. That's nobody really does that, and it's kind of crazy, and it would be confusing. But this is actually valid code, so you can actually do the pre-fill and then go to the cases if the user wasn't found, fill this out, and then return the view. I'm gonna undo that because I don't like it, but I just wanted to show you that the insane option is there as well. So I'm going to leave that for now. Let's just get rid of all this stuff. And there's our index view. It's not perfect, not view. There's our index method. It's not perfect, but it's a little better than what it was, in my opinion. All right, let's take a look at the submit method now. Now remember, the submit method is what happens when you actually click the little submit button on the form, so you can fill out your, after you filled out your information, you submit it. Post to this method, we validate the data, we store it in the database, and then we kick them off to the content. Now, the first thing I notice is that I should not be able to call get on this. Like, I should not be able to do a get request to this. So I'm just going to be explicit and make it post. I don't know. I just prefer that. I feel like if you don't have a verb attribute on it, it's probably a get. But if you're doing something other than a get, you should be explicit. The other thing that might matter to you is anti-forgery tokens. On this one, we're not actually taking any action, so it wouldn't make any sense for someone to forge this submission. But if this were like editing content, deleting things, or something important that someone might actually try to hack this, it's probably a good idea to have the anti-forgery token. Now, if you're not familiar with this, just Google it and figure it out. That's very helpful. Thanks, Bob. Thanks for telling me to figure it out. Thanks for helping me Google stuff. But yeah, if you're doing a form submission of some kind, and that form submission has a consequence, you should probably validate anti-forgery tokens. You will have to add, HTML.anti-forgery token, something like that, to your form in the view. But that's all you really have to do. Okay, so let's take a look at what this is actually doing. So if it's valid, we add the record to the database, and this apparently returns the record. I think that's a bug. I think this is actually supposed to be, let's see here, does this return a record? Yeah, this is actually supposed to be record equals, so that's actually a mistake I made, but in my faking of this code. But yeah, so it's trying to add the submission of the record to the database. It just passes in the stuff that you've submitted, and this returns a record. We have a catch exception, and then we do nothing. So that burns. Okay, let's keep going. We'll come back to it. Next, this was a cool idea from marketing. I've never actually seen this, but I thought it would be funny. When you submit the form, we have the site send you an email, and somebody thought it would be cool to have our latest tweets in the email. And so here we call the Twitter service to get the latest company tweets, and we create a list. And another empty catch. Okay, I'm not as worried about this one because the truth is we don't care if Twitter's down, but it's still kind of ugly. All right. So next we call some kind of email service to build the email, create a new mail message, an SMTP client. We send the message and then we redirect them with content. Okay. Otherwise, if it's not valid, here's some duplicated code. We fill out that hear about us thing again, and then return the view. This time we have to be explicit that we're returning the index view because the method is submit. So this is correct. But okay, so let's start with the easy stuff. So first of all, we have these two big branches. I don't like if statements that span a long vertical space, because if you've got a small screen, you might only see these lines, and then as you scroll through, you'll see this else, and you'll be like, what else is that going to? So I like to, if possible, keep my if statements pretty concise, and the easy way to do that, because this is small, is to move this chunk up, and then negate this. Wow. Okay. Let me fix this horrible stuff I just did. And then I think I probably have an extra one down there. Yeah. Reformat. Thank you. So now I'm doing the thing I like to do where, if it's not valid, we fill this out and we bail early. And so now I don't have this big long if statement. I just basically have an early exit, and then I continue. So again, we have this duplicated code here. We're setting the here about us, then we're setting it here. There's a few things we could do to fix this. So we could take this list and make it like a static read-only list and just reference it instead. And so what that might look like is you would normally put it here, but I'm going to put it here just for, just because. We'll call this drop down selection items. You probably want to name this a little better, but we create this, and so now this duplicated code just becomes referencing that. I don't love that, but that works. That's fine. It helps. And honestly, if I saw this in a code review, I would be totally fine with it. It's not a big deal. But we still have a tiny bit of duplicated code. If you want to be really hardcore about not duplicating code, and if you had like a bunch of drop-down items or more parts of the view model that required initialization, I would definitely consider doing this. But instead of having these 2 lines of code repeated, you could create a method that basically contains those lines of code and call it like index view or something. Make sure it's private so you can't call it, you can't call it by going to a particular URL. And then we just move this in here, and then we just return that view. There we go. So that's a possibility. You probably wouldn't shove it in between these 2 methods, and you wouldn't have this list in here, but just for the demo purposes, I'm just shoving them here for now. I'd probably put this at the top of the class because it's kind of a constant. It can't actually be declared as a constant because it's a list, but we can make it read-only, and so it's sort of like a constant. Not really. And then this index view I'd maybe put at the bottom of the file or something, and hopefully this is a pattern. If you do this, this kind of becomes a pattern that maybe you'll see in your controllers, and then your team will start to recognize, so it won't be weird when they're going through and they're like, index view, what is that, an MVC thing? Or, so moving on. We've removed the duplicated code. So next we're looking at the submission record equals null. We're setting it to null. We're doing the try catch. I can't remove this. If I remove this null set here, the compiler should complain down here because I'm accessing record without it being initialized. I like this because it's pointing out a potential bug to me. If I initialize this to null here, what could happen is something here fails. We catch the exception, throw it away the way you should never do, and then we move on. And then when it comes down here to build email, record is going to be null, potentially, because add submission record threw an exception, so the set never happened, it remains null. So now, instead of getting an error here that I could track down, I'm getting a null exception somewhere in build email, and now it's way harder to track down. What is happening? I don't know why we're catching this exception, but I'm going to remove this. And so now that equals null thing becomes a unnecessary assignment, and now we're just assigning this. Now, if the idea is that if something goes wrong, we still want them to get to the content, we can still do a try catch, but I want to do it over the entire thing instead. I don't want to have try catch, try catch, try catch. That's Pokemon error handling. You're trying to catch them all, and it's just it's a lot of boilerplate that you don't need to do, and it's easy to make mistakes. And I'd prefer to just kind of catch this whole thing. So if any part of this fails, we still send them to the content because they did fill out the form, Now, the compiler is telling me I'm not using this. It's giving me a warning that X is declared and never used. That's a really important warning to pay attention to, because if something does go wrong in here, we're never going to hear about it, because from the client's perspective, everything worked. And we're just going to get a ticket saying, how come none of our submissions are showing up? Or how come no one's receiving emails from us? And you're going to have nothing to go off of. But up here, I saw that we have error logger. And I noticed that we have 0 references because I don't know why we should be using this. So down in here, I'm going to check. Looks like we have service log error. Perfect. So now when I get that ticket that says emails aren't being sent, or no one, submission records aren't showing up or whatever, I can go to our error log and I have something to work off of. And so this is so important. Let's go up here, though, to this Twitter thing. So we have list tweets equals null, and we build an email. So once again, we have the same issue. We might be sending in a null, and the build email service may not know how to deal with null. Okay. If I look at the definition for build email, and this is just a mock-up, but it's actually accepting an IEnumerable. So I don't have to, if I look up here, I'm actually doing a toList. I don't need to do that. I don't need to create a list. I could just pass in an IEnumerable, and I think I'm going to use that to my advantage here. So now it's tempting to take this catch out, right? Because I just talked about how if any part of this fails, I just want to send them to the content. But I don't want to, if Twitter is down, I still want to send the email. And so this catch here actually makes sense. The one thing I want to do, though, is, again, I just want to make sure I actually log it. And the other thing I want to do is tweets could be null. I don't know if build service or build email is going to like null. And so I might just do this. And it's tweet. And so now tweets is at least not null. It might say latest tweets and just be empty, but that's better than not sending the email at all, right? So I think we've fixed that up a little bit. Should we remove toList? That would require a little bit of thought and time and research, because there might be a good reason for this. Maybe the build email service iterates through the list a whole bunch of times. And so get latest company tweets returns an IEnumerable, which can be lazy executed. And so what that means is every time we iterate that, for all we know, it might be calling out to Twitter again. And so that might be a performance issue if we iterate it 5 times for a single email, which that, if you're iterating it 5 times for a single email, that's pretty strange, but we don't know what's happening in build email. And so maybe they're just trying to protect themselves. I'm going to leave toList here for right now. Maybe, a potential future thing would be to look into build email and see, does it iterate the list a bunch of times? If it doesn't, you might be okay. But again, because enumerables are, lazy loaded, I guess. They're, I forget the exact term. The one issue of taking this off is if I take this off, it could potentially mean that when tweets is iterated, that's when it throws the exception. And so this part will succeed, and then when it gets into build email, that's when it will fail. So I think I'm definitely going to leave toList right here. This forces this enumerable to be enumerated at this moment while it's in the try-catch block. Okay, so we build the email. That looks good. We create a message. I'm just going to note one thing. We're creating a message that is from the email address they submit to the email they submit. This will probably trigger spam filters. So, you're going to want this to come from something else. And, you wouldn't hard code this, but you would want to have this come from like your company email or some domain that your mail server has permission to send for. Don't send it from their email address. And then, your submission probably make this content or configurable in some way. You wouldn't want to hard code this, but all right, SMTP client. Technically, SMTP client is disposable. I think you should put that in a using statement. I actually don't know off the top of my head if it matters, but and then we redirect content. All right, so I think this method is in a pretty good place at this point. We validate early, and if it's not valid, we just sort of bail out. We don't do a bunch of extra work. We've moved some try catches around, so we're not doing as many of them, and we make sure that in every case where we're catching an exception, we're logging it. I think the one thing that I would consider changing, and this would be maybe a future update, is right here where we're using an SMTP client directly in a controller. That feels a little ugly to me. I'm a big fan of you ain't gonna need it, right? Where don't try to future-proof your code to the point where every possible conceivable thing is a service, because sometimes that's not helpful. But I will say that in my experience, it is usually helpful to move anything that sends email out into its own service rather than calling SMTP client directly. The reason for that is, one, you might decide that you need, retry policies or something like that. That's a lot easier if it's already in a service. if it's in a service, you can put a try catch around it and make sure that you're logging email errors specifically for sending emails. You can put in policies about whether or not a failed email should throw the exception and fail the entire process, or if it should just silently continue, if it should go into a queue or something. And the most common thing that I run into is we start with SMTP client, and then we go to a service that sends emails, and they have an API that works better than calling SMTP. And so we don't want to use SMTP client anymore. We just want to call their API because it's way more reliable. And so if you have that abstracted into a service, it's much easier to fix down the road. So I don't always like to just guess at what things are going to need to be abstracted in the future. I don't like to just make every possible thing a service with an interface, because then we just add so many layers of abstraction, it's hard to tell what's even going on. But in this case, I think an SMTP client, calling SMTP client, is worth pulling out early and putting into a service, because that one almost always benefits from being a service. So I think that's it for this one. Thanks for listening to me ramble for, I don't know, like 20 minutes or 30 minutes. This was a long one. So thanks for joining me.